Hey everybody, I'm Paul and welcome to Is It Watchable's Real Spiel, where I talk about movies, television, animation, pretty much anything you watch on a screen. Like this episode, where I'm talking about something that most of us have loved since our parents first sat us down in front of a television: cartoons. When asked to name some of their favorite cartoons, most people will likely list ones that aired when they were growing up, which makes sense because nostalgia plays a big part in forming our opinions. Like, I was a kid in the late 70s and early 80s, and I definitely have some fond memories of cartoons from that era, but were they the best? Ask some of my friends who are around my age and they'll say, hell yeah, but I'm not so sure. So I thought I'd make a lot of people mad by taking a look at the last 50 years of cartoons and ranking each decade from best to worst. And because I'm not a complete D-bag, I won't even make you wait until the end to see my list. Here it is. Now, if you're too blinded by rage to hear me out, at least take this poll before you leave and let me know which decade you think is the best. And also, feel free to tell me how stupid I am in the comments. For those still with me, allow me to make my case. Now, first off, I should say that I totally realized that by starting with the 1970s, I am leaving out some awesome cartoons. All the great Looney Tunes shorts, Tom and Jerry, and the Tex Avery cartoons of the 1940s, or the 50s and 60s that introduced us to Yogi Bear, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and the Flintstones. But I think any cartoon debate can just as easily be divided by generation as it can by decade. And as a guy who falls squarely in the Generation X demographic, I can say that we're probably the first generation that never fully grew up. We never stopped watching cartoons, we never stopped playing video games, we never stopped reading comic books, we never stopped collecting toys. With few exceptions, the same really can't be said for the generations that preceded us. For example, asking my parents, baby boomers, which decade they think is the best for cartoons would get you nowhere. They probably can't even name more than a few cartoons since the Flintstones went off the air: Scooby Doo, the Smurfs, the Simpsons, Spongebob. Also, I want to point out that I'll be largely leaving out anime and other cartoons that weren't readily available on broadcast or cable television in the United States. Not because I'm a xenophobe, I totally enjoy watching great animation from all over the world now, but 9-year-old me back in 1983 just didn't have the access, and like I said, the cartoons we watched growing up had the greatest impact. I also didn't consider any cartoons aimed at the preschool crowd. Dora the Explorer, Bubble Guppies, Paw Patrol, those shows are measured with a completely different set of criteria. And finally, only television cartoons, no animated movies. All that said, let's get on with it. The 70s deserve a lot of credit for taking the Saturday morning format that was introduced in the mid-60s and turning it into a reason for 3 decades worth of kids to wake up early on a weekend. It gave us classics like the Super Friends, Laugh Olympics, Fat Albert, Schoolhouse Rock, and of course, the great Scooby Doo, which actually premiered in 1969 but aired the vast majority of its episodes in the 70s. Not too shabby, but I think the biggest problem with cartoons from the 1970s is that they seem to lack originality. I mentioned Scooby Doo, a show about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their dog. Well, how about The New Shmoo, a show about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their shape-shifting monster? Or Fang Face, about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their werewolf friend? Or Speed Buggy, about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their talking car? Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels, about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their caveman pal? Goober and the Ghost Chasers, about a group of teenagers who solve mysteries with the help of their dog. So actually, I guess that one's exactly like Scooby Doo. I picture production meetings where they went, just switch out the non-human sidekicks. Kids are stupid, they won't know the difference. And it wasn't just other cartoons copying Scooby Doo. Scooby Doo was constantly copying itself. Nearly every episode is exactly the same. The gang is driving in the mystery machine, they stumble upon a mystery, they split up, usually Fred, Daphne, and Velma in one group, Shaggy and Scooby in the other. Shaggy and Scooby get the munchies, they set a trap to catch the monster or ghost. The monster or ghost is unmasked to reveal it's just a local trying to scare people away for money reasons. But let's face it, it's still an awesome cartoon. And when they weren't cloning existing cartoons, it seems like they were just looking around at whatever was popular at the time and turning that into a cartoon. There were cartoon versions of The Brady Bunch, Star Trek, That Show Emergency, Gilligan's Island, The Partridge Family, The Osmonds, The Addams Family, The Three Stooges, Tarzan, Planet of the Apes, Lassie, The Jackson 5, Muhammad Ali. I'm not saying all of those are bad. Star Trek and Planet of the Apes are pretty good. It's just that when you take it all together, you start to wonder if, along with the gas shortage of the 1970s, if there wasn't also an imagination shortage when it came to cartoons. In 1980, I was 6 years old, so these were prime cartoon watching years, and man, did I watch me some cartoons. We're talking G.I. Joe, Transformers, Voltron, He-Man, Thundercats, DuckTales, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, just to name a few. To anyone who grew up in that era, that's like the Hall of Fame of cartoons. And best of all, none of those that I mentioned were Saturday morning cartoons, so every day after school, we could run home, warm up a can of Pac-Man pasta, and see which road beast Hagar was gonna unleash that day. And we love those cartoons because why wouldn't we? They were great, right? I mean, they were good, weren't they? I don't know, man. Nostalgia has a sneaky way of clouding our judgment and making everything from our childhood seem way better than they actually were. For example, a couple years ago, I thought I'd show my son how awesome the original He-Man cartoon was. Guys, it was embarrassing. I was embarrassed watching it. To his credit, my 10-year-old was totally diplomatic about it, but I could tell he was like, what the F is this? And of course, looking back now, we know what the problem was. We weren't watching the creative results of a team of talented writers, artists, and animators. We were watching a hastily slapped together half-hour commercial. The He-Man cartoon was expressly made to move Masters of the Universe action figures that came out 1 year before it premiered. Same with the G.I. Joe cartoon. Same with Transformers. Thundercats? Same. Brave Star? Same. Care Bears, My Little Pony, Pound Puppies. The Rubik's Cube had a cartoon. And that list is by no means complete. But Paul, you might say, they're still using cartoons to sell stuff today. Granted, but guys, the 80s took it to another level. The California Raisins had a cartoon. And when you consider some of the Saturday morning cartoons, the Smurfs, Pac-Man, Mr. T, the Littles, the Snorks, Kid Video, the Muppet Babies, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. Now I realize hearing some of those titles brings back the warm fuzzies of sitting crisscross applesauce in front of the TV with a bowl of Donkey Kong cereal, but most of those cartoons were trash. I mean, not all, but if we're being honest and can take off the rose-colored glasses, most. Probably the best Saturday morning cartoon was the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, which consisted of cartoons made before I was even born. But coming in a close second is 1987's Mighty Mouse: The New Adventures from animation genius Ralph Bakshi, and a little taste of things to come. Just like Nirvana saved us from crappy 80s hair metal, Nicktoons saved us from crappy 80s corporate-driven cartoons. Now, that might sound a little dramatic, but so is what happened to cartoons in the 1990s. I first saw Ren and Stimpy in a dormitory day room in 1991. I hadn't heard of it before, but I was mesmerized. I watched the whole thing, and by the time it was over, there were 4 other guys in the room watching it with me. A group of 18 and 19-year-olds wondering what the hell we just saw. And you know that in houses across the country, there were 8 and 9-year-olds wondering what the hell they just saw. What we saw was the changing of the guard. Nickelodeon was looking to air a block of original cartoons and brought in animators to pitch their ideas. Now, that might not seem all that groundbreaking by today's standards, but consider everything I just said about the 80s. They didn't bring people in and say, hey, we've got this stuffed animal and we need you to make a cartoon about it. They brought in artists and said, hey, what do you got? Boom. It was a breath of fresh air, and it didn't take long for other studios to get in on the fun. It was like back in the days of Looney Tunes. Suddenly cartoons were edgy and irreverent with humor that appealed to both kids and adults. And in 1992, we saw the launch of an entire network dedicated to cartoons. But it wasn't all just wacky and crazy. For those who like more serious cartoons, the 90s saw your Transformers and raised you Batman the Animated Series. Stylish and well written with fantastic voice acting. It might be debatable whether it's the best superhero cartoon ever, but what's not debatable is that it was the best superhero cartoon up to that point. And maybe best of all, 90s cartoons didn't forget all of us who grew up in the 80s and who are now adults. There was Liquid Television, Daria, Celebrity Deathmatch, Dr. Katz, Duckman, South Park, King of the Hill, and of course, The Simpsons, which premiered with only 14 days left in 1989, so it's really a 90s show. Regardless of what you think of The Simpsons now, its impact on animation and television in general can't be disputed. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch to say that nearly every cartoon of the last 3 decades is an indirect result of either The Simpsons or Ren and Stimpy. The 90s paved the way, and the 2000s hit the accelerator. Cartoons were everywhere. It was like being in cartoon heaven. On the more mature side of things, we were still tuning into The Simpsons and South Park, but now we also had shows like Family Guy, Futurama, Robot Chicken, The Venture Brothers, The Brak Show, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and more. And even entire blocks of animated programming aimed squarely at adults, like Cartoon Network's 2001 launch of Adult Swim, or Fox's animation domination in 2005. And for the kiddos, things were just as good with Phineas and Ferb, Billy and Mandy, The Fairly Odd Parents, Flapjack, Chowder, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, and the wildly imaginative Amazing World of Gumball. Not to mention the rise of one of animation's greatest characters, probably only second to Bugs Bunny. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. SpongeBob SquarePants. Love him or hate him, I love him by the way, you have to admit, his impact has been huge. That show's been on the air for 20 years and counting. He has 2 movies, and in the best way to measure the greatness of any cartoon, it appeals to nearly every age group. Old folks might get butthurt hearing this, but SpongeBob is as good as any cartoon ever. For the action-adventure crowd, there's the Great Justice League, Samurai Jack, Star Wars The Clone Wars, Ben 10, Avatar The Last Airbender, and for you old schoolers out there, a very good and very underrated reboot of Masters of the Universe. The point is, there was a lot of good stuff, and something for everybody. Even Playboy had an animated show in the 2000s. Which brings us to the current decade, and while I realize it's not quite over yet, personally, I've seen enough already to safely say that we are firmly planted in the golden age of cartoons. And it's not just because there are more cartoons than ever to choose from, it's that they've gone next level in almost every department. Breathtaking artwork like the gothic meets anime look and feel of Netflix's Castlevania, or the gallery-ready landscapes of The Legend of Korra. Fantastic writing, I mean, who didn't want to stick around to find out about the other two journals in Gravity Falls, or if Wirt and Greg would find their way home and Over the Garden Wall. Mind-bending premises like the workplace comedy Acid Trip of Regular Show, or the anything goes fever dream of Adventure Time. The manic wackiness of Rick and Morty, the sophisticated mature humor of Archer, the exaggerated relatableness of Bob's Burgers. And if you don't like any of those, that's okay because, like I said before, there's lots to choose from because in addition to Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, Disney, and other cable channels, now the streaming services like Netflix have gotten into the game. Not all of their cartoons are great, but if you want choices, they are killing it. And when you consider that we get all of that with current seasons of our old favorites like The Simpsons and Spongebob and Family Guy, South Park, all of which are still going strong, or at least still going, we could literally watch nothing but cartoons and be happy as clams. Honestly, guys, if you love cartoons, it's a good time to be alive. So taking another look at my ratings, I think my case for the 90s being on top is pretty clear. The seismic shift from corporate to creator-driven cartoons and the lasting influence on everything that came after made the 90s to cartoons what the 60s were to rock music. The sheer number of classics that came out of that decade was off the charts. Even some shows that became popular in the 2000s were created in the 1990s. Family Guy, Futurama, and Spongebob all premiered in 1999. Toss in The Simpsons and 3 of those 4 shows are still on the air today. The 2010's and the 2000's took the ball and never looked back, with the 2010's getting a slight nod for arguably having more high-quality cartoons for all age groups than ever before. The 70's brings up the rear because it kind of seems like they just didn't give a shit. And then there's the 80's. Look, the 80's hold a spot near and dear to many people's hearts, including my own, so the fact that it appears I'm bashing those cartoons might not sit well with some folks, especially people from my generation who consider them our cartoons. But I think we can take comfort in the fact that they really weren't our cartoons. We didn't make them. A bunch of white dudes in bad 80s suits who hadn't watched cartoons for entertainment since they were kids were deciding what we should watch, deciding what the show should be about, deciding the cheapest way to animate those shows. We were just kids. People my parents' age were making those cartoons. The same people who bought you a GoBot when you really wanted a Transformer, because what's the difference? And then something magical happened. All of us kids who grew up in the 70's and 80's were now adults in the 90's, and we were the ones making the cartoons. Well, not me specifically, but my generation. We made shows based on what we always wanted to see growing up, or shows we loved but wish were a little different, like a lot less snarf in the Thundercats. We were in charge. The inmates were running the asylum, and the craziness that ensued was beautiful. Same with the kids who grew up in the 80's and 90's who made the great cartoons of the 2000's, or the kids who grew up in the 90's and 2000's who are absolutely crushing it with cartoons today. So no need to defend bad cartoons from the 70's and 80's when it's much more fun to blame our parents. Well, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate it. And if you know somebody who has really strong opinions when it comes to animation, share this video with them because I'd really like to see what other people think is the greatest decade for cartoons.